In a few seconds, you will hear the rain sound. The daytime is so loud, but out here you can finally take a real breath. Let the road do the work tonight. Even the smallest roadside items hold memories. The dash cam just glinted off a crushed, rusted soda can sitting on a concrete barrier. It's been there for decades, left behind by someone who vanished into these woods. I can feel their spirit inside my car right now, creating an eerie pressure and giving me goosebumps. But you are safe here, as I am hearing this rain while driving. No worries. When the story starts, it will all calm down naturally and make the atmosphere soothing so you can relax for the rest of the night. The rapid-fire rhythm of modern life leaves our minds running. But tonight, we find a pure wall of peace. I'm Deb, and this is True Horror Stories Film. Before we begin, if these videos help you drift off, it would mean a lot if you left a like or subscribed, or just wrote something small in the comments. Even a single word. It helps other tired people find their way here too. Now, let us begin. Hey, come sit with me for a little while. Whatever today was, whatever it took from you, you can set it down right here. You do not have to carry it for the next hour. What I have for you tonight is dark and slow, and it is going to stay with you after it is done. That is all I ask, that you let it stay. There is a number I cannot stop counting. One more than the boxes. I have checked it 41 times across 3 months. In 4 different cities, in the middle of the night with a flashlight when the archive closed around me, and I was too stubborn to leave. One more than the boxes. I know what that means. I have always known what it means. I just needed long enough in the dark to admit that knowing it was never going to be enough. I want to tell you something about chain of custody logs before I tell you anything else, because if you do not understand what they are, you will not understand what I found. And if you do not understand what I found, you will not understand why I am telling this from somewhere I have not given anyone my address. A chain of custody log is a document that follows physical evidence from the moment it is collected to the moment it is presented in court or retired to an archive. Every person who touches the evidence signs the log. Every transfer is dated. Every item is numbered. The log is the story the evidence tells about itself, about where it has been, and whose hands it has passed through. And a forensic document analyst like me reads that story the way other people read sentences. You develop a feel for the rhythm of it. You learn to hear when something is missing, the same way a person who has listened to music their whole life hears when a note is wrong. I have been doing this work for 22 years. I am good at it. I was good at it before Marcus Doyle spent 11 years in a California state prison for a crime someone else committed. And I was better at it after, because after Marcus Doyle I learned that being good at reading what a document says is not the same thing as being good at reading what a document is hiding. Those are 2 different skills. I had one of them. I spent 7 years building the second. By the time the Ketty request came to me, I thought I had both. I was wrong about that, but I did not know it yet in September, when Ellen Whitmore called my office in Sacramento and told me she needed someone to review what remained of the evidence files from a 40-year-old homicide case in Plumas County. She was soft-spoken on the phone, in a way that told me she had learned to be, the way people learn things they did not choose to learn. She told me her name. She told me the case number. She told me her mother had been murdered in cabin 28 of the Keddy Resort on the 14th of April, 1981, when Ellen was 9 years old, and that she and her younger siblings had been in the next room. She said that last part the way people say things they have said 10,000 times, not without feeling. With a feeling so practiced and so compressed that it had gone somewhere beneath language, somewhere the voice could not follow anymore. She said she had submitted a formal records request to the Plumas County Sheriff's Department and received 43 pages in response. She believed there should be more. She wanted someone to tell her if she was right. I told her I would need to see what she had received before I could tell her anything at all. She said she would send it. We ended the call. I sat at my desk for a moment, with my hand still on the phone, which I do not usually do, and I thought about the fact that she had been 9 years old, and that the wall between her room and her mother's room had been thin enough that the sounds came through, and that she had heard everything. Then I went and made coffee, because there was nothing else I could do about any of that. And I waited for the files to arrive. They came 3 days later, a thick envelope with Ellen Whitmore's return address in a town I did not recognize, postmarked from somewhere in Shasta County. I sat down with them at my kitchen table on a Thursday evening in mid-September, with the coffee going and the window open behind me, and the sound of the neighbor's dog moving around on the other side of the fence. The first thing I did before I read a single page was count the items in the chain of custody log. I counted them twice. Then I counted the evidence boxes referenced in the log's item column. The log listed 44 items. The boxes listed in the adjacent column numbered 43. I set the log down. I picked it back up. I read each line again, slowly, the way you read something when you need it to have changed since the last time you looked at it. It had not changed. 44 items. 43 boxes. One discrepancy. Not large enough to mean anything obvious. Large enough, in my experience, to mean something had been removed, or had been added to the log without a corresponding physical item ever being collected, or had simply been lost to 40 years of transfer and storage. It could be an error. Clerical errors exist. I have seen them in every case file I have ever reviewed. Small divergences between what was logged and what was stored, most of them completely innocent, most of them explainable in 30 seconds by someone who was present at the original collection and remembered which box they had left off a label on. The problem was that no one who had been present at the original collection was available to ask. The lead investigator on the case had died in 2012. His partner had retired to Arizona and was not, according to the department, reachable for comment on closed case inquiries. The chain of custody log had no notation, the side discrepant item, which was listed only as item 37, with a collection date of April 15th, 1981, and a description that read, "Juvenile hand-drawn document, recovered from main structure, condition deteriorated. A child's drawing." That was what item 37 was. Recovered from cabin 28 the morning after the murders. 1 day after the children who had survived were taken away, and the cabin had been sealed. A drawing, in a box that no longer appeared in the evidence record. I wrote it down in my notebook as an anomaly to be investigated. I underlined it once. I moved on to the rest of the 43 pages and spent the next 3 hours reading. What I will tell you is this. The files Ellen Whitmore had received were not the files of a well-managed investigation. I have reviewed the documentation of hundreds of homicide cases, and I know the difference between an investigation that lacked resources and an investigation that lacked will. The Ketty files were an investigation that had stopped, not because it ran out of leads, but because at some point in the mid-1980s, the pace of documentation simply slowed and then ceased. There were gaps between entries that stretched to months. There were follow-up items listed in one document and never referenced again in any subsequent document. There was a note from 1983, in a handwriting I could not identify because it was not signed, that referenced a second set of files being transferred to a regional office with a case number that did not match the case number on any other document in the packet. A second set of files, transferred, unreferenced, thereafter. I wrote that down too. By the time I closed the envelope, it was past midnight. The dog next door had gone quiet. The coffee had gone cold at some point while I was reading, and I had not noticed. I sat in the kitchen with the papers spread across the table, and I thought about Ellen Whitmore's voice on the phone. The compressed, practiced quality of it. The way she had said "next room" was as though the words were two stones she had been carrying for 40 years and had put down on a table between us. I thought about the fact that the cabin had been demolished in 2004, that the county had not sold it, had not renovated it, and had simply taken it down and cleared the ground. I had looked that up after her call. The official reason was structural deterioration. I had filed that under possible and moved on. Now, sitting in my kitchen at midnight, I filed it under something else and did not write down what that something else was. I called Ellen Whitmore the next morning. I told her what I had found. I told her it was not conclusive, that a single numerical discrepancy in a 40-year-old chain of custody log was not evidence of anything on its own, but that the combination of the discrepancy, the unreferenced transfer notation, and the gaps in the documentation record suggested she had not received a complete set of files. I told her I would need to travel to Plumas County to review whatever remained in the physical archive before I could say anything more specific. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "I knew something was missing. I knew it when they sent me 43 pages. My mother's name appears on the cover sheet, and then the files just stop in 1986. And there is no closure document, there is no final summary, there is nothing." I knew. I said, "I understand." She said, "Will you go?" I said, "Yes." I drove up in October, 6 weeks after the initial call, because it took that long to arrange access to the county archive and to clear my other caseload. The drive from Sacramento to Quincy takes roughly 3 hours on a good day, up through the Sierra Nevada foothills on Highway 70, through a landscape that changes so gradually you do not notice it changing, until you look up and realize the houses have thinned to almost nothing, and the trees are pressing close on both sides of the road, and the sky has gone from wide and flat to a narrow gray strip between two walls of pine. I had driven mountain roads before. I had driven through remote places before. This felt different in a way I could not name, and so I did not try to name it. I turned the heat up and drove. The county archive was housed in a building adjacent to the sheriff's department in Quincy. A town of roughly 4,000 people that sits in a valley in the mountains and has the particular quality of small mountain towns in the off-season. A quietness that is not peaceful but withheld, as though the town is holding something back and has been for a long time. The archive administrator was a woman named Carolyn Reese, who had been with the department for 19 years, and who met me at the door with a key card and a manner that was professionally courteous and entirely opaque. She showed me to a room with 2 folding tables, a single fluorescent light overhead, and 4 gray archival boxes that she set down in front of me and said represented the complete physical holdings for the case number I had referenced. I thanked her. She left. I put on my gloves and opened the first box. I will not walk you through every hour I spent in that room across the 2 days I was there, because most of it was the slow, quiet work of authentication and comparison that does not make for the kind of story you can follow easily from the outside. What I will tell you is what I found, and when I found it, and what it did to me. The first day I spent cross-referencing the physical contents of the 4 boxes against the chain of custody log from Ellen Whitmore's packet. I worked methodically, item by item, box by box, logging each piece, checking its condition against the logged condition, and noting any divergences. By 3 in the afternoon, I had confirmed the discrepancy. Item 37 was not in any of the 4 boxes. There was no box labeled 37. There was no gap in the physical numbering that would indicate a box had been removed. The numbering went from 36 to 38, without acknowledgement that 37 existed, which is not the same as something being misplaced. Misplaced items leave a gap. This left a skip. Someone had renumbered. I sat with that for a long time. Renumbering is not something that happens accidentally. It is not a clerical error. It requires intention. Someone had to have noticed the gap, understood what it meant, and chosen to close it, which meant someone had also chosen to remove the item first. And whoever had done that had not done a complete job, because they had not updated the chain of custody log. They had removed the box and renumbered the adjacent items and left the log untouched, which either meant they had not thought to check the log, or they had not had access to it, or they had been in a hurry. None of those options were comfortable. All of them meant the same thing, which was that someone with physical access to the Plumas County Archive had removed evidence from a homicide case. I wrote this in my notebook in precise language, and I did not let myself think about the implications yet, because implications were not what I was being paid to document. I was being paid to document facts. The fact was a skip in the numbering. The fact was an item listed in a chain of custody log that did not exist in the physical archive. The fact was that the item was a child's drawing, recovered from a cabin where a mother and 2 others had been murdered, and a 12-year-old girl had been taken away into the night and not found for 2 years, and then found as a skull, and then not explained. I closed my notebook and drove back to the motel I was staying at on the edge of Quincy. I ate a sandwich from a gas station because everything else had closed. I called Ellen Whitmore and told her what I had found and told her I was not done yet and would call again when I was. She said, "Okay." She said, "Thank you." She said the same 2 words the same way. And I understood that she had said them 10,000 times to 10,000 people who had not been able to give her anything more than what I was giving her, which was only the confirmation of what she had already known. The second day, I went back. The archive opened at 8. Carolyn Reese let me in with the same key card and the same opaque courtesy and set me up in the same room. I was deep in the third box by 10 o'clock, reviewing a series of interview transcripts from the days immediately following the murders, when I found something I was not looking for. In a folder near the back of box 3, beneath 2 sets of crime scene photographs that had been placed face down and fastened with a clip, there was a single sheet of paper that should not have been there. It was a transfer receipt, dated 2019, not 1981. 38 years after the murders, and 5 years before I was sitting in that room, looking at it. The receipt documented the transfer of one item from an external holding location to the Plumas County Archive. The item was listed as a juvenile hand-drawn document, original condition, case reference redacted. The case reference had been redacted with a black marker that had bled slightly on the left side, leaving a partial character visible. The character looked like a 7. Item 37. A drawing was transferred into the archive in 2019 from somewhere external, and then not in the archive when I looked for it. Removed again, or transferred again, between 2019 and this October morning in 2023. I held the paper very carefully. I was aware of my hands. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me because the rest of me was not. I thought about what this meant in sequence. The drawing had been collected in April of 1981. It had left the archive at some point, removed by someone with access, and held somewhere external for an unknown period of time. In 2019, it was transferred back in. At some point between 2019 and the present, it left again, and this time whoever removed it also renumbered the boxes to close the gap, but did not have access to, or did not think to update the chain of custody log that Ellen Whitmore received in response to her formal records request. Ellen had submitted her formal records request in August of 2023, 8 weeks before I drove up here. I made a copy of the transfer receipt using my phone camera, took 3 photographs from 3 angles, and placed the original back exactly where I had found it, in the folder, beneath the photographs, with the clip refastened. I closed the box. I sat for a moment with my hands flat on the table. Then I began packing up my materials, methodically, the way I do everything. And I thought about what I was going to tell Ellen Whitmore, and I thought about a chain of custody log with 44 items and 43 boxes, and I thought about a 12-year-old girl named Tina Sharp, who left cabin 28 on the night of April 14th, 1981, and did not return, whose skull was found in a neighboring county 2 years later. And I thought about a child's drawing recovered from the cabin the morning after, the only document in the entire file described as juvenile, as belonging to a child. I was in the parking lot, unlocking my car, when I remembered something I had not thought about since the first night I read the files. In the list of children who had been removed from the cabin and taken into protective custody on the night of the murders, there was a name I had registered and moved past. Tina Sharp's younger brother, 7 years old at the time. His statement, one of the shortest in the file, said that he had been in the second bedroom with the other children, that he had not seen anything, that he had heard sounds but could not describe them, that he had been asleep, and then one more line, which I had read and filed away without understanding why I was filing it. He had told the responding officer that he had left his drawing book in the front room because he had been showing it to his sister before bed. His drawing book, left in the front room, the same room where his mother died. Juvenile hand-drawn document recovered from main structure. I sat in my car for a long time in the parking lot. The trees were very close on the other side of the fence at the edge of the lot. It was cold in the way that October in the Sierra Nevada foothills is cold. Not the cold of temperature alone, but the cold of altitude and shadow, and the particular quality of light through dense pine that makes midday look like dusk. I looked at the trees and I thought, someone took that drawing out of this archive. Someone held it somewhere for years. Someone brought it back in 2019, and then someone took it again after Ellen Whitmore submitted her records request. I thought about who might know a 7-year-old boy's drawing book was significant. I thought about who would have had access to the archive. I thought about the note in the original files, referencing a second set of documents transferred to a regional office with a mismatched case number. A second set that had never been referenced again, that could be anywhere, that could contain anything. I thought about the fact that I had been certified to review these files by the county, that Carolyn Reese had known I was coming for 6 weeks, that the transfer receipt I found had been placed inside a folder beneath face-down photographs, which is not where a legitimate transfer receipt is stored, which is not a location a careless person stumbles into, which is a location someone chose deliberately either to hide something or to ensure a specific person would find it. I drove back toward Quincy. After about a mile, I pulled over on the shoulder of the highway, between 2 walls of pine that closed the sky to a strip above me, and I sat with the engine running for a while. The receipt in the folder, face down, beneath photographs, in a box in a room that Carolyn Reese had prepared specifically for me. Someone had left it there for me to find. I called Ellen Whitmore from the shoulder of Highway 70, and I told her what I had found and what I believed it meant. She listened without interrupting, which is something very few people can do when you are telling them something that changes what they already knew. When I finished, she was quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Who took it back in 2019? I said I did not know, she said, but someone brought it back. Someone had it and brought it back. I said yes. She said, my brother has been in contact with the department for years. He has been trying to get information about the case since our mother's memorial in 2018. He told me someone called him last year. A man he did not know. Said he had something that belonged to the family. I said, did he meet with them? She said, he said yes. He said the man gave him an envelope. He said he never told me what was in it because he did not want to upset me. I did not push him. I thought it was photographs. Something like that. I said, Ellen, ask him. She said she would call me back. She called back in 40 minutes. She said, it was a drawing of the cabin. He recognized it immediately. He said there was a name written on the back in their mother's handwriting. I said, whose name? She said, Tina's. I am going to stop for a moment, because I want you to understand something about what that meant. A drawing made by a 7-year-old boy, recovered from a cabin where his mother was murdered and his sister was taken, held outside official evidence storage for an unknown period of time, returned to the archive in 2019, removed again in 2023 after a formal records request from the surviving family. and then separately delivered to the surviving family by an unknown man who said he had something that belonged to them. 2 copies, or 1 copy that moved, or something else entirely that I do not have a clean explanation for, which is a sentence I have written in my notes and crossed out and rewritten 4 times, and which I am leaving in, because not having a clean explanation is the most honest thing I can tell you about. Where this ended, I drove back to Sacramento the next morning. I submitted my report to Ellen Whitmore with full documentation of the numbered discrepancy, the transfer receipt, and the gap in the case record. I recommended she retain legal counsel and request a formal audit of the archive. I recommended she ask her brother to have the drawing he received examined by a document forensics laboratory to establish its provenance and condition. I did not recommend she pursue it further herself. I said that in the report in plain language. I said, the evidence record of this case contains deliberate alterations made by a person or persons with physical access to the Plumas County Sheriff's Department archive. The motive for those alterations is unknown. The timeline of the most recent alteration corresponds to the submission of your records request. You should be careful. 3 weeks after I submitted the report, I received an envelope at my office in Sacramento. No return address. Postmarked Quincy, California. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, in print that had the quality of an older photocopier, slightly uneven and slightly darker on the left margin, a chain of custody log. Not the one Ellen Whitmore had received, a different one. 46 items, not 44. 2 more items than the log I had reviewed. 2 additional entries at the bottom, below item 44, in a slightly different typeface, as though they had been added later. Item 45, audio recording, cassette format, labeled in juvenile handwriting, recovered from vehicle associated with redacted, date of collection redacted. Item 46, correspondence, handwritten, 1 page, found inside item 45 case, author unknown. I have looked at that sheet of paper many times since October. I have looked at it under magnification. I have analyzed the paper stock, the ink composition, and the printing characteristics. The paper is consistent with standard archive reproduction stock from the mid-1990s. The ink is consistent with a Xerox photocopier manufactured between 1990 and 2000. The typeface discrepancy between the original 44 items and the 2 additional items is consistent with a manual typewriter, a different machine, added to the document at a different time. Someone made this record in the 1990s. Someone kept it. Someone mailed it to me 3 weeks after I submitted my report. I have not been back to Quincy. I have not called Carolyn Reese. I have referred Ellen Whitmore to a civil rights attorney in San Francisco who specializes in cold case evidence suppression, and I have given her copies of everything I have. And I have told her I am continuing to review the materials I was sent, and will be in contact when I have more. I am still reviewing. There is still more. What I know for certain is this. A child made a drawing in a cabin in the Sierra Nevada foothills on the night of April 13th, 1981, the night before his mother died and his sister was taken. The drawing was recovered. The drawing moved through hands I cannot fully account for over 40 years, across a distance and a silence that official records do not explain. Someone has been keeping track of it. Someone, for reasons I cannot name, decided I should know that. I think about Marcus Doyle sometimes. 11 years in a California state prison. I certified a file I was given, and I did not ask what was missing, and the missing thing was the thing that mattered. I have spent 7 years building the skill to ask that question. I have gotten very good at it. I am still not sure what the answer is, but I know there is one. I know it exists somewhere in a file I have not seen yet, in a log with 2 more items than the one I was meant to find, in the handwriting on the back of a drawing that a boy made the last night his family was whole, in a cassette labeled in juvenile handwriting that someone put in an envelope sometime in the 1990s and addressed to no one and never sent. I live somewhere quiet now. I have not given anyone my address. One more than the boxes. I am still counting. I have certified 9,412 cause of death documents in my career. I know this because I counted them the week after Bay County. I sat in my apartment in Tallahassee with the bedroom door closed, and I went back through every case log I had kept since 1989, and I counted 9,412 files, every one of them signed by me, every one of them marked complete. I have not been able to open a case file since. That was 14 months ago, and the one I cannot stop thinking about, the one I returned to this morning before I even made coffee, is not the worst thing I have ever seen in a file. It is not the most violent case I was ever assigned. It is the one where everything was in order. Every form, every signature, every notation in its proper place. It is the one where the file was perfect. And I still wake up at 3 in the morning knowing what that means. I need you to stay with me for a little while longer tonight. What I am about to hand you is not comfortable, but it is true. And I think you already know that some true things do not resolve, that some official documents are exactly what they appear to be, and still wrong in a way no one will ever formally acknowledge. If you know that feeling, this story is for you. If you have never felt it, I am sorry for what tonight is about to teach you. Here is what I need you to understand before we begin. She did not go to Bay County looking for horror. She went because she was very good at her job. And her job, it turned out, was exactly what the horror needed her to be. The drive from Tallahassee to Panama City takes just under 2 hours on US 988, and in January the road runs along a coast that does not look like the Florida anyone comes here for. The tourist Florida is pastel and bright and smells like sunscreen and restaurant grease. The January coast is gray and flat and smells like the Gulf actually smells, which is salt and something older underneath it, something biological and cold. The billboard for a water park I passed near Carabel had been sun-faded to near white. The woman on it was still smiling. You could barely see her anymore, but she was smiling. I had been hired by a civil rights attorney named Darnell Okafor to assist with a wrongful death appeal. He was soft-spoken on the phone and precise in his language, and he did not tell me more than I needed to know, which I respected. He told me the case involved a juvenile who had died in a state-contracted facility in Bay County in 2006. He told me there was a cause of death determination he wanted me to examine. He told me my job was not to make a finding. My job was to verify the completeness of the record. I remember that phrase specifically, the completeness of the record. I told him I could do that. It was the truest thing I said to him in the entire time I worked the case. My name is Carol Renner. I have a master's degree in health information management from the University of Florida and a certification from the American Health Information Management Association that I have renewed every 2 years since 1993. I am 51 years old. I have reviewed cause of death documentation in 43 Florida counties. I am considered, by the attorneys who hire me and the agencies that contract at me, to be among the most thorough forensic records reviewers in the state. I want to say that clearly, not out of pride, because it matters to the story. Because my thoroughness is the thing that found what it found, and my thoroughness is also the thing that certified it. Both of those things are true. I need you to hold both of them at the same time, or the ending will not make sense. The Bay County Courthouse Annex, where the case files were being held for the appeal, was a low beige building on Harrison Avenue, the kind of government architecture that communicates nothing, except that the people who built it wanted it to last and did not care how it looked. Darnell met me in the parking lot. He was younger than his voice, in his mid-30s, wearing a gray coat that was too light for the January cold. He handed me a visitor badge and a file box, and told me the room I would be working in was down the hall from the clerk's office. He said, "I appreciate you coming down for this." I said, "What do you need me to find?" He said, "I need you to find everything that is there, and I need to know if anything is missing." I told him I understood. He nodded and looked at the box in my hands and then looked away, toward the parking lot, toward the gray strip of sky above the courthouse roof. He said, "The family has been waiting a long time." I said I would be thorough. He said, "I know you will." The room was small and fluorescent and smelled of recycled air and old paper. There was a folding table with 2 chairs and a plastic cup of pens someone had left and not come back for. A window looked out onto a parking structure. The light outside was the same temperature as the light inside, which made the window feel decorative. Something to suggest the concept of outside without actually providing it. I set the file box on the table and took off my coat and hung it on the back of the chair and sat down. I have opened a great many case files. I have opened them in hospital basements and county offices and the back rooms of medical examiners' suites. I have opened files that contained photographs I did not expect and language that still surfaces in my memory at inconvenient moments. I have learned to approach a file box the same way every time. Methodical, sequential, without anticipation. You read what is there. You note what is not there. You do not bring anything with you into the file. I opened the Anderson file at 9:14 in the morning. The first thing I noticed was the temperature notation on page 6 of the initial autopsy report. Body temperature at time of examination, 73.4 degrees Fahrenheit. I noted it the way I note everything, a data point. I moved on. There was a sensible explanation. Temperature variance in transit, a notation error in transcription, or a recorder who had been imprecise with their decimal. I had seen all of these. I noted it with a small pencil mark in the margin and turned the page. The file was extraordinarily complete. That is the first thing I want to say about it, because I know how unusual it is, and because at the time I found it reassuring. Every intake form present. Every incident report is present. The facility's internal log for January 6th, 2006, present. dated, and initialed. The first autopsy report is present. The medical examiner's signed certification is present. The chain of evidence documentation for the surveillance footage is present. The toxicology results are present. The subsequent forensic autopsy, commissioned by the family, is present, paperclipped to a response from the county medical examiner's office. Also present. Everything the file should contain, it contained. I had been in that room for 4 hours before I understood what that meant. Around noon, I went to the vending machine down the hall and bought a coffee in a paper cup and brought it back to the table. I remember the particular weight of it, the way the cup was still almost too hot to hold, and I held it anyway because the room was cold and I had been sitting still for a long time. I set it on the table next to the file. I told myself I would take a break after the next section. I did not take a break after the next section. The thing about reviewing cause of death documentation is that you are not reading for content in the way most people read. You are reading for architecture. You are looking at how the document was built, what was put there and when, and what the sequence of decisions reveals about the mind that made them. A cause of death ruling is not just a conclusion. It is a record of a professional reasoning through evidence in real time. And the structure of that reasoning is visible in the document if you know where to look. I know where to look. That is the job. What I noticed in the Anderson file starting around 2 in the afternoon was that the architecture of the initial autopsy report was unusual in a specific way. The conclusions were unusually early. The evidentiary narrative, the section where the medical examiner walks through the physical findings that support the ruling, was thin in proportion to the certainty of the conclusion. This is not uncommon. Underfunded county offices, overworked examiners, and a backlog that turns thoroughness into a luxury. I have reviewed hundreds of reports with this shape, but the thinness was in specific places, not throughout. The sections describing the external examination were thorough. The sections describing the internal findings were thorough. The thinness was exclusively in the section bridging the physical findings to the cause of death determination. The section where the examiner explains why the body's physical state leads to this particular conclusion and not another. In most reports, that bridge is 2 to 4 paragraphs. It is where the professional shows their reasoning. In this report, it was 1 paragraph, 4 sentences. The 4th sentence was the ruling. I noted it. I told myself it was thin, but not absent. I told myself it was a documentation style I had seen before. I turned the page. The coffee was cold. I do not know when it went cold. I had not noticed. I picked it up and drank it anyway, because the motion was something to do with my hands that was not turning a page. And then I set the cup down and turned the page. The second thing I noticed, around 3 in the afternoon, was the intake log. The facility's internal intake log for January 6, 2006, showed the boys' initial processing completed at 8:51 in the morning. The first emergency call to Bay County Emergency Services was placed at 11:22 in the morning. I knew from the broader case record, from the news coverage Darnell had included in the briefing materials, that the surveillance footage covered the period between these 2 times. I had not seen the footage. It was not my assignment to view it. My assignment was the file. But the intake log was in the file, and the emergency call time was in the file, and the body temperature at the time of examination was in the file. 73.4 degrees Fahrenheit. I turned back to page 6. The examination had been conducted at 1:47 in the afternoon. I sat with that for a moment. Then I took out my pencil and my notepad, and I did the calculation. I am not a forensic pathologist. I do not have the training to make a cause of death determination. But the post-mortem body temperature calculation, the rate at which a human body loses heat after death, is standard reference knowledge in my field. 1 to 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour, under average conditions, the Gulf Coast in January, a building, a room. If the examination was conducted at 1:47 in the afternoon, and the body temperature was 73.4 degrees, the temperature implied a time of death approximately 40 minutes earlier than the time recorded in the official ruling. 40 minutes. I sat at the table in that fluorescent room and looked at the number I had written, and looked at the intake log, and looked at the emergency call time, and understood that the temperature notation on page 6 was not a transcription error. It was the only accurate number in the file, and it pointed to a window of time between when the surveillance footage ended and when the first emergency call was placed. I sat there for a long time. The parking structure outside the window had gone dark. The fluorescent light in the room had not changed. It could have been any time at all. Here is what I want to tell you about what it feels like to find something like that. It does not feel like discovery. It does not feel like revelation. It does not feel like the clean, clarifying moment I had always assumed it would feel like. In the abstract, if I ever found something a file was hiding, it feels like standing in a room where the furniture is wrong, where everything is in its place. The chairs are at the table, the cup is by the sink, the coat is on the hook, and all of it is 1 inch to the left of where it should be. Not enough to name, enough to make the body certain before the mind catches up. I knew what the temperature meant. I knew what the gap between the footage end time and the emergency call meant. I knew what the thinness of the evidentiary bridge in the cause of death determination meant. Now that I was looking at it again with the temperature in mind, I also knew that none of this was my finding to make. I was not a forensic pathologist. I was not an investigator. I was a records reviewer, and my job was to verify the completeness of the record. And the record was complete. Every form, every signature, every notation in its proper place. The temperature reading on page 6 had been there since 2006. Anyone who reviewed this file could have seen it. Any forensic pathologist retained by any party to this case could have run the calculation I ran. The number had been sitting in the file for 9 years, in plain sight, in a complete record. I thought about the 7 years I had been carrying the other case, the file in Citrus County. The inconsistency I noticed and did not flag. The reason I did not flag it was not corruption. It was not malice. It was a calculation I made in the moment about the weight of the inconsistency against the certainty of the examiner, against the completeness of everything else in the file, and against my own professional position as a reviewer and not a pathologist. I told myself the inconsistency was minor. I signed the form. I marked it complete. I had been telling myself it was minor for 7 years. I was better at believing it some days than others. The lingering detail was not dramatic in itself. A body temperature 4 degrees below where it should have been. A number so small, so embedded in the technical language of a forensic document, that the people who most needed to notice it had looked at this file for 9 years and moved past it. I had noticed it in the first hour. I had assigned it an innocent explanation and moved past it too. I called Darnell at 4:30 and told him the file was complete. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Everything is present," I said. "Every required document, every required signature, every required notation. The file is complete," he said, "and nothing is missing." I said, "Nothing missing." He was quiet again. I could hear faintly what might have been traffic or rain outside wherever he was. He said, "I see." He said, "Thank you, Carol." He said, "I appreciate your thoroughness." I told him I would have the formal certification to him by end of week. After I hung up, I stood in the hallway outside the file room for what I can only estimate was several minutes. Though I cannot account for the time precisely, the hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights ran the length of the ceiling and made no sound. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed, and footsteps moved away from me, and then there was nothing. I went back into the room and put the file back in the box, and put the lid on the box, and put my coat on. I picked up the paper cup of cold coffee from the table and held it for a moment. Then I put it down and left it there. The drive back to Tallahassee takes just under 2 hours. I know because I have driven it many times before Bay County and since. The road runs back along the same January coast, the same gray water, the same faded billboards. By 5 o'clock in January, the light is already going, and by the time I reached the stretch of road outside Kerbel, the sky had gone the color of old paper, and the billboard with the smiling woman was dark, dark against it. Just the shape of a sign, just the outline of something that had once been trying to tell you something. I did not stop. I drove. I thought about the temperature reading. I thought about it the way I have thought about the Citrus County inconsistency for 7 years, which is to say, I did not think about it directly, but kept it in my peripheral vision, kept it at the edge of the thing I was looking at, because looking at it directly was something I had not yet decided to do. I completed the formal certification 3 days later. I certified the Anderson file as complete and accurate in its documentation, as containing all required elements, and as meeting the standards for admissibility in civil proceedings. I signed my name. I dated it. I sent it to Darnell's office. He called me the following Monday. He thanked me. He said the appeal would proceed. He said the family appreciated my work. He said he hoped we would work together again. I thanked him and told him I hoped so too. I made a cup of coffee after I hung up, because I had not yet made one that morning, and I sat down at my kitchen table and pulled the cup toward me and wrapped both hands around it. It was warm, not hot, the way I usually liked it, but warm, a temperature I would normally have considered acceptable for coffee I had let sit too long. I held it and looked at the morning light coming through the kitchen window and thought about how long I must have been sitting there before I noticed the cup had cooled. I have certified 9,412 cause of death documents in my career. 9,412 files. Every one of them signed by me. I know that somewhere in that number there are files I reviewed and certified as complete, whose completeness was doing the same work the Anderson file's completeness was doing. I know this. The way I know the temperature reading on page 6. Not because I went looking for it. Because I know what to look for. And because I have known for a long time that a complete file and a true file are not always the same thing. And I kept signing them anyway, because my job was to certify completeness, and the files were complete, and I was very good at my job. The boy's name was Martin Lee Anderson. He was 14 years old. His file is complete. I certified it. There is a smell that does not belong to old paper. I have worked with old paper my entire career. I know what it smells like. Dust, and slow damp, and the particular sweetness of cellulose breaking down over decades into something almost like flour. I know that smell the way a baker knows their kitchen. I know it is not dangerous. What came off those files was not that smell. It was something underneath it. Something that had been there long before the paper aged, pressed into the fibers like a signature. I did not know what it was on the first day. By the third day, I knew. And by the time I knew, I had already touched everything. I want to tell you something before the story begins. The women in this account were real. Their names are in the public record. I will not use them here, because the story I am about to tell is mine, not theirs, and I do not have the right to put my experience alongside what they carried. What I will tell you is that they were young, and they were trusting, and they were told by people who knew better that what was killing them was safe. This is not their story. It is the story of what happens when someone like me sits down with what they left behind. My name is Delia Marsh, and I have been an occupational health archivist for 23 years. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you what happened in Ottawa, because what happened in Ottawa only makes sense if you understand what I do and why I believed, for most of my career, that I was good at it. An occupational health archive is not a library. It is a legal record, a documented history of what a company knew about the risks its workers faced, when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. My job is to review those records for completeness before they enter litigation. I assess whether the archive is whole, whether the timeline is unbroken, whether what the record says it contains is in fact what it contains. I am not an investigator. I am a reader of completeness. The distinction matters. A complete archive tells the truth by existing. An incomplete archive tells a different kind of truth by the shape of what is missing. My skill, the thing I was trained to do, the thing I have done in 37 cases across 2 decades, is to see both, to read what is there, and to read the shape of what is not. I was very good at it. I believed I was very good at it. That belief is what brought me to Ottawa in the first week of November. And it is what kept me in that archive room for 6 days longer than the assignment required. And it is the reason I am writing this now, from a house I moved into 14 months ago, in a city where no one knows my name, where I keep the windows open, even in winter, because I need to be able to hear the air moving. The case came to me through a university legal department. A historian working on the Radium Dial Company litigation had located a previously uncatalogued collection of internal company documents in a county record storage facility outside Ottawa. The collection had been sealed in a climate-controlled transfer case since the late 1970s. When the facility absorbed the contents of a demolished administrative building. No one had assessed the collection. The historian needed someone to certify its completeness before it could be entered into an academic archive and made available to researchers. It was a routine assignment, 4 to 6 days of careful review, one signed certification of completeness at the end, or a documented findings report if the collection was fragmentary. I had done this kind of work 37 times. I drove to Ottawa on a Sunday. The Fox River was low for November, the color of old pewter, and the light was already going by 3 in the afternoon. The town had the particular quietness of Midwestern places that have outlived the thing that made them. Not emptiness, exactly, but a stillness that settles in when an industry is gone, and the streets have not yet found another reason for themselves. I ate alone at a diner near the motel and went to bed early. The county facility opened at 8. I wanted to be there when the doors unlocked. The archivist at the facility was a man named Gerald, who was close to retirement and very kind. He showed me to the review room, a long, clean space with fluorescent lighting and 2 wide examination tables, and brought out the transfer case on a wheeled cart. The case was gray metal, the size of a steamer trunk, sealed with a notarized tag from 1979. Gerald cut the tag and lifted the lid. The smell came up first. It was old paper, yes. That familiar sweetness, that slow cellulose warmth I have known since my first archive room in a basement in Milwaukee in 2001. But beneath it, or inside it, or woven through it so thoroughly I could not locate where it began, there was something else, something mineral and faintly sharp, something that reminded me at a distance I could not quite close, of metal left too long in the sun. I wrote it down in my field notes as possible chemical off-gassing from the transfer case sealant. Gerald nodded when I mentioned it, and said he had noticed it too, years ago when the collection first came in. He said he had always assumed it was the old building, something in the walls. I accepted this and began my work. The collection was larger than I had expected. Approximately 900 documents spanning 1922 through 1951, comprising internal correspondence, personnel records, production logs, payroll registers, supplier invoices, and a series of files labeled in a hand I did not immediately recognize as medical notation. I worked through the first morning carefully and methodically, building the inventory the way I always do. Chronologically first, then by category, then cross-referencing dates against the master correspondence log to identify any gaps in the timeline. The documents were in extraordinary condition. The transfer case had done its job. The paper was supple, the ink clear, the handwriting in the early files a precise copper plate that moved across each page with the particular confidence of someone who believed what they were writing would matter. I noticed the smear near the end of the first morning. It was on a letter dated March of 1926, addressed from the company's production supervisor to the regional sales office in Chicago. The letter concerned dial output targets for the second quarter, routine administrative correspondence. At the upper right corner of the page, above the letterhead, there was a thin curved stroke, pale, barely visible, the color of old cream, that crossed the corner at an angle consistent with a paintbrush being set down too close to the page and dragged slightly as it was lifted. I photographed it and noted it in my inventory as probable production contamination. A brush left carelessly near paperwork in an era when the painting floor and the administrative offices occupied the same building. I assigned it an origin consistent with the physical layout of the company's recorded premises. I set the letter aside and continued. The second day, I reached the medical files. They were gathered in a folder marked in that same precise copperplate hand. Health and Welfare, Personnel. The folder contained 31 documents, intake records for employees, a series of general health assessments dated between 1924 and 1928, 2 letters from an outside physician engaged to conduct workplace evaluations, and a single internal memorandum from the company's medical director, dated September of 1926. I read the memorandum 3 times. It was 6 paragraphs long. The first 2 paragraphs described, in careful clinical language, a pattern of dental deterioration observed in a significant number of dial painters over the preceding 18 months. The third paragraph noted a correlation between the duration of employment and the severity of the deterioration. The fourth paragraph referenced published research from New Jersey, where similar cases had been documented among workers at a competing facility, and concluded that the pattern was consistent with chronic radium ingestion. The fifth paragraph recommended immediate suspension of the lip-pointing technique and full medical evaluation of all current dial painters. The sixth paragraph was a single sentence. It read, "This memorandum is submitted for the attention of management and is not intended for inclusion in personnel health files or external correspondence." I sat with that sentence for a long time. I know how to read what a document says. I also know how to read what a document is for. A memorandum submitted to management for attention and specifically withheld from personnel files and external correspondence is not an advisory document. It is a record of a decision. The decision is embedded in the instruction about where the document should not go. Someone read this memorandum. Someone received it. Someone understood what the fifth paragraph recommended and chose not to act on that recommendation, and understood that the memorandum itself was evidence of that choice, and specified in the sixth paragraph that the evidence should not travel beyond the room where the choice was made. I photographed the memorandum and filed it under the medical section of my inventory, and sat very still at the examination table for approximately 3 minutes before I continued working. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in those 3 minutes, because being honest about it is the only reason I am writing this. I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something that sat between them and borrowed from both, something I recognized from a long way back, as the particular feeling of seeing a familiar shape in an unfamiliar document, the shape of a decision made in a room by people who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway, and who understood, also, that the doing of it would need a careful paper trail, and who understood paper trails the way I understood them, which meant they also understood precisely how to construct a gap. That feeling is professional. I have felt it before. I know how to work through it. I did not know on the second day that I had already begun to understand what the archive was. The third day was when the smell changed. I do not mean it became stronger. I mean I became more specific about it. I was working through the payroll registers from 1927 through 1930. cross-referencing employee names against the health assessment files to build a timeline of who was employed during the period after the medical director's memorandum. I was doing this mechanically, the way I do it, writing names and dates in columns in my field notebook, and I became aware that the mineral sharpness beneath the paper smell had a temperature, that it was not cold, the way metal smells cold, but warm, the way something warm radiates. I stopped writing and looked at my hands. My gloves were on. They were always on. But I became aware of them in a way I had not been before. Aware of the layer between my skin and the paper in a way that felt newly important, the way you become newly aware of the thickness of the ice when something shifts beneath your feet on a frozen lake. I checked my equipment, checked the integrity of the gloves, checked the ventilation in the review room, made a note in my field log that I was experiencing olfactory fatigue, common to prolonged archival work, and would increase break frequency. I believed this. I wrote it down, and I believed it. I went back to the payroll registers. 42 names appeared in the payroll registers between September of 1926, the month of the medical director's memorandum, and March of 1929. I cross-referenced each name against the health assessment files. 29 of the 42 had health assessments on file. The remaining 13 had payroll records showing continuous employment through the period. They had no health assessments at all. 13 employees with no health record in a folder that the file cover designated as Health and Welfare Personnel. This is the shape of a gap. A gap in an archive does not announce itself. It does not leave a blank page or a missing folder. The most carefully constructed gaps leave exactly the evidence they intend to leave, and omit exactly the evidence they intend to omit, so that a reader who trusts the record will read completeness where completeness does not exist. I know this. I have known it for 23 years. I sat at the examination table and looked at the column of 13 names without health records, and I felt the thing I have worked very hard not to feel since 2012, which is the specific cold knowledge that I have been here before. In 2012, I certified a corporate health archive as complete for a plastics manufacturer in Ohio. The case settled. The family involved received a compensation agreement based on a documented exposure timeline that I had reviewed and signed. 8 months after the settlement, a researcher working on a separate case located a series of internal medical assessments that had been removed from the collection before I reviewed it and stored separately in an off-site facility. The assessments showed the company had known about the exposure risk 4 years earlier. Then the timeline I had certified. The family had been undercompensated by a significant amount. The gap had been constructed by someone who understood exactly how archivists read completeness, who understood, that is to say, that an archivist reads what is there, and trusts that what is not there was never there. I reported my error. I submitted a full findings amendment. I cooperated with every subsequent review. I was cleared of professional negligence because the removal of the assessments from the collection had been deliberate concealment by the company's legal team, not an archival error on my part. I have told myself this for 10 years. It is accurate. It is also, I understand now, the wrong thing to have focused on. I looked at the column of 13 names. I thought, without meaning to. Someone knew how I read. The fourth day I found the second smear. I was reviewing a set of supplier invoices from 1928 when I located a letter that should not have been in the suppliers section. It had been misfiled or placed, I could not determine which, among invoices for raw materials. The letter was dated November of 1926, 2 months after the medical director's memorandum. It was addressed from a senior company official to a legal consultant in Chicago. The letter discussed, in language so carefully oblique I had to read it 4 times before I understood what it was saying, the management of employee medical claims and the advisability of standardizing the language used in health assessment forms going forward. At the upper right corner of the letter, above the letterhead, there was a thin curved stroke. The same stroke, the same angle, the same pale cream color. I photographed it and set the letter next to the March 1926 letter on the examination table and looked at both smears under my magnifying glass for a long time. The strokes were identical in angle and width. They had been made by the same brush, held in the same hand, set down in the same careless way, onto papers resting on the same surface. A March letter about production targets, a November letter about managing medical claims, the same desk, the same hand, the same brush. I looked at the date on the November letter, November 1926. The same month the company's medical director would have received a response to his September memorandum. The same month someone would have read the 5th paragraph, the recommendation, and decided not to act on it. Someone had been painting at a desk where they also signed letters about managing the medical claims of the people the painting was killing. The body understands things before the mind has finished building the sentence. I know this professionally. I have written about it in findings reports when describing how witnesses described the moment they understood what a document meant. The hand goes cold. The field of vision narrows slightly at the edges, the way a room does when the light drops. The breath becomes something you are aware of in the chest, something with texture. I was aware of all of this. I wrote it down in my field notes as noting elevated stress response, taking a 10-minute break. I went to the hallway outside the review room and stood under the fluorescent light and thought about the diner near the motel where I had eaten alone on Sunday, and whether they would still be serving dinner by the time I finished for the day, and what I would order. I thought about this with the careful focus of someone reaching for something manageable in the presence of something that is not. I thought, soup, I will get the soup. Then I went back inside. The 5th day, I found the production logs from 1927. The production logs were detailed records of daily dial output by workstation. Each workstation had a number. Each entry recorded the number of dials painted, the quantity of luminous paint used, and this was what I had not seen in production logs from this period before. A column labeled simply Q, followed by a numerical score between 1 and 5. I did not know what Q measured. There was no legend in the log. There was no notation explaining the column's function. I cross-referenced the Q scores against the payroll records. The highest Q scores, the 4s and 5s, corresponded consistently to workers with the longest continuous employment records. Workers with lower Q scores were, in several cases, listed as separated from employment within months of the log entries. I looked at the column for a long time. Q for quality, Q for quantity, Q for the precision of a fine-pointed brush, applied to a small luminous dial by a woman who had been trained to put the brush to her lips. The workers with the highest Q scores had been there the longest, had been painting the longest, had been pointing the longest. The workers with the highest Q scores did not appear in the health assessment files I had already reviewed. 13 names with no health assessments. The 13 names with the longest employment records. The 13 names with the highest Q scores in the production logs. I sat at the examination table and looked at the column of Q scores and felt my vision narrow at the edges in the way I had noted on the fourth day, and tried, this time, to let the narrowing happen rather than writing it down in my field notes as something to be managed. Someone had kept records of who was the best at what was killing them. Someone had known from September of 1926 that the technique was lethal, and had kept records for at least the following year of which workers were the best at that technique, and had ensured that those workers had no individual health assessments in the archive. I am an archivist. I read completeness. I read the shape of what is missing. The shape of what was missing from this archive was not random omission. It was not an administrative error. It was not the ordinary entropy of records that have passed through too many hands. The shape of what was missing was the precise negative silhouette of 13 women who were very good at what they did, and whose health records had been removed with the same care and precision that their work was measured by. Someone had read these records the same way I read records. Someone had understood exactly what an archivist looks for, exactly how completeness is assessed, exactly which documents need to be present, and which can be absent without creating a traceable gap, and had removed exactly the right things. I thought about the Ohio case in 2012 for the first time without the careful distance I had maintained for 10 years. I thought they did not hide the documents from an investigator. They hid them from someone who reads the way I read. They understood that an archivist trusts a complete record, so they built a complete record. They understood that an archivist identifies gaps by looking for what is absent, so they made sure that what was absent did not leave an absence. They understood that the most dangerous thing you could do to an archivist's certainty was give her a record that looked right. My hands were on the examination table, flat and gloved, and I looked at them for a moment, and then I looked at the production logs, and then I looked at the letter with the second smear, still sitting beside the March letter at the edge of the table. The same brush, the same desk, the same hand. I thought they were still painting when they wrote the letter about managing the claims. They were still pointing the brush when they decided what to do about the women who were already sick. And I thought I certified the Ohio record as complete. And I thought someone built that record for someone like me to certify. Gerald knocked on the review room door at 6 o'clock and told me the facility was closing. I had been at the examination table for 9 hours. I looked up, and the fluorescent light felt thin and too bright, the way light feels when you have been reading for too long in a room that does not change. I told Gerald I would need 2 more days. He said that was fine. He asked if I was all right. He said I looked pale. I told him I was experiencing olfactory fatigue, and thanked him for his concern. He left, and I sat alone in the review room for a few minutes before I packed my materials and stood up. The transfer case was open on the cart beside the table, The collection spread across both examination surfaces, my field notes in 2 full notebooks beside my camera and magnifying glass. The smell was still there, a warm, mineral, underneath the paper smell. The smell I had written down as chemical off-gassing from the transfer case sealant. I stood in the room and breathed it for a moment. It was not the sealant. I had known on the 3rd day that it was not the sealant. I had written it down in my field notes as the sealant because I needed to keep working, and naming it something harmless allowed me to keep working, and I had a certification to complete. I packed my bag and went to dinner. I ordered the soup. I ate it. I went back to the motel, and I lay on the bed in my coat, and I looked at the ceiling, and I did not sleep. The 6th day I found the photograph. It was in a folder I had not yet opened, a miscellaneous collection of internal communications from 1929 through 1931, which I had set aside for my final review day. The photograph was tucked between 2 letters, loose, without a label or a date notation on its face. It showed an interior room, a large, light-filled space with tall windows along one wall, a row of work tables, and at the far end, separated from the painting floor by a low wooden partition, a smaller administrative area with 2 desks. The photograph had the soft overexposure of early flash photography, which gave the white surfaces a slight luminosity, the dials on the work tables, the paper on the desks, the women standing at the painting stations with small brushes in their hands. I looked at the administrative desks at the far end of the room. On the nearer desk, at the upper right corner, there was a pale stroke of light. The photograph was black and white. The stroke could have been a reflection, could have been a scratch on the negative, could have been the overexposure of the flash on a small bright object. I looked at the angle of the stroke, and I looked at the 2 letters on the examination table, and I looked at my hands. The desk in the photograph was not the painting supervisor's station. The desk in the photograph was the medical director's desk. I knew this, because the personnel records I had reviewed on the 2nd day included a facility diagram used for an insurance assessment in 1928, and the 2 desks at the far end of the painting floor, separated by the low partition, were labeled in the diagram in that same precise copper plate hand. The medical director's desk was the nearer one, the one with the pale stroke at the upper right corner. I photographed the photograph and sat at the examination table and did not move for a long time. The medical director had written the memorandum, had seen the dental deterioration, had read the research from New Jersey, had written, in 5 careful paragraphs, that the technique was lethal, and had recommended its immediate suspension, had written, in the 6th paragraph, that the memorandum should not travel beyond the room where it was read, and had continued to work at a desk on the same floor as the painting stations, close enough that a brush set down carelessly left a stroke on a letter. Close enough to smell what I was smelling. I want to tell you what I understand now that I did not understand when I drove to Ottawa in November. I have spent 23 years believing that my job was to read records. What I understand now is that I was reading records the way the people who built those records needed me to read them. I was trained to find completeness and to certify it. I was trained, that is to say, to trust an archive that had been assembled by people who understood exactly what I would look for and exactly what I would not. The Ohio record was complete. I certified it. It was missing 13 assessments that had been filed separately in a location I had no reason to know existed, because nothing in the record I reviewed indicated that anything was absent. The record was complete. The record was also a lie, and the lie was built by someone who understood that I would read completeness rather than the truth. What I did not ask in Ohio, and what I had never asked in 37 cases across 23 years, was not whether the record was complete. It was whether completeness itself had been designed as the concealment. There is a difference between an archive that is missing things and an archive that has been built to look like it is missing nothing. I knew the first kind. I had never allowed myself to fully know the second one. I had certified the Ohio record and told myself for 10 years that the fault was with the company's legal team, not with my reading. I was right. The fault was with the company's legal team. But the company's legal team had built the record for someone who read the way I read, and I had read it the way they built it for me to read. And a family had been undercompensated because I had read completeness and had not asked whether completeness was the falsification. I asked Gerald for one more day on the 6th day, and he said, "Of course," and brought me coffee, which I thanked him for and did not drink. I completed the inventory. I documented every gap I could identify through cross-referencing. I noted the 13 missing health assessments, the correlation between Q scores and missing records, the 2 letters with the matching paint smears, and the photograph. I wrote a detailed findings report that ran to 31 pages and concluded that the collection was not certifiably complete and that the pattern of omissions was consistent with deliberate removal of documents rather than ordinary archival degradation. I signed the findings report with my name and my certification number and my professional designation. Then I drove out of Ottawa on a Thursday afternoon, and the Fox River was still the color of old pewter, and the light was still going early, and I stopped on the bridge over the river and looked at the water for a while before I kept driving. I moved 4 months later, not because of the archive, because of what the archive showed me about what I had been doing for 23 years, and what I had not been asking, and why I had not been asking it. I still do this work. I am still an archivist. I read records for a living, and I certify completeness, or I document the shape of what is missing, and I am still, I believe, good at it. But I ask a different question now at the beginning of every review. Before I look at what is there, I ask who built this record, and what they knew about how I read, and whether the completeness I am about to certify is the thing they needed someone like me to certify. It is a slower way to work. It produces longer findings reports. It makes some clients uncomfortable. I have not certified a complete record since Ottawa. I think about those 13 women sometimes, in the quiet hours, when the windows are open and I can hear the air moving through the room. I think about the Q scores in the production log, the careful measurement of precision, and the record of who was best at what was being done to them. I think about the 6th paragraph of the memorandum, the single sentence specifying where the document should not go. I think about the medical director at his desk on the painting floor, close enough to the workstations to leave a paint stroke on his correspondence. He knew. He wrote it down. He told the truth in 5 paragraphs, and then told the truth again about what he intended to do with the truth, which was nothing. And he continued working at his desk, in a room full of women who were pointing their brushes with their lips. and the paint on his correspondence glowed in the dark, and he signed his name to the memorandum with the same pen he used for everything else. What the archive kept was not the record of what the company knew. What the archive kept was the record of how carefully someone had read what I would look for. I had been reading the same way for 23 years. I had never asked who built the archive I was reading, or what they knew about readers like me, or whether the thing I was being trusted to certify was the instrument I was being trusted to certify with. The archive was built by people who understood completeness. So was the one in Ohio, and I had read both of them the only way I knew how. The windows are open. The air is moving. The room smells like nothing in particular, like a room where nothing has been pressed into the walls, where the paper is just paper, and the smell is just the smell that paper makes when it is old and has not been touched. I leave the windows open because I need to know the air is moving. I still know the smell of old paper. I still know it is not dangerous. I also know now that knowing something is not dangerous and knowing it is safe are not the same thing, and have never been, and that I built 23 years of work on the certainty that they were. That is what Ottawa gave me. That, and the understanding that somewhere in a county records facility in Illinois, in a transfer case that smells of warm mineral and old cellulose, there are 13 names without health assessments. And someone built the record that way on purpose. And someone like me was always going to be the one to certify it. There is a photograph I cannot stop looking at. I have looked at thousands of photographs in my career. Crime scenes, collapsed structures, the aftermath of things that should not have happened but did. I have a professional relationship with what photographs show and what they do not show, and I have spent 20 years trusting that relationship the way other people trust gravity. The photograph I cannot stop looking at was taken in June of 1912 in a small house in southwest Iowa, 3 weeks after 8 people were killed in their sleep inside it. What I found in that photograph, no one had found in 112 years. What I found in that photograph is still in that house. I know this because I went and looked. I want to say something before the story begins. Because the story is mine, and the house belongs to other people, and I want to be careful with the difference. 8 people died in Villisca, Iowa, on the night of June 9th into the morning of June 10th, 1912. 6 of them were children. The youngest was 2 years old. I am not going to use their names, because what happened to them is not my story to tell, and I do not have the right to put my experience alongside theirs. What I will tell you is what I found. And what I found is that some things do not stay in photographs. They stay in houses. My name is Nora Voss, and I have been a forensic evidence photographer for 22 years. I want you to understand what that means. Specifically, before I tell you what happened in Villisca last October, because what happened in Villisca only makes sense against what I have spent 22 years believing. A forensic evidence photographer is not a crime scene photographer. The distinction matters. A crime scene photographer arrives first or near to first and documents the scene in its unaltered state. Before hands touch anything, before the investigators spread through the rooms, before the work of understanding begins to change the thing being understood. A forensic evidence photographer arrives after all of that. After the investigators, after the documentation, after the trial, and the verdict, and sometimes after the appeal. My job is to go back. I document what remains in the physical record. I photograph the evidence that still exists. The structures, the surfaces, the objects that were not moved or were moved and returned. And I compare my documentation against the original crime scene photographs to determine whether what the physical record currently shows is consistent with what the photographs showed at the time of the event. I am, in the simplest terms, a reader of photographs, not a reader of what photographs show. Any trained investigator can do that. A reader of what photographs mean, of the gap between what the frame contains and what the scene contained, of the angle chosen by the photographer, and what that angle necessarily excluded, of the light sources present, and what they illuminated, and what they left dark. I have done this work in 41 cases across 22 years. I have testified in 11 trials. I have a reputation among the insurance attorneys who hire me and the opposing counsel who do not, for finding things in old photographs that other readers did not find. This reputation is accurate. It is also, I understand now, what made me the wrong person to go to Villisca. The commission came through a historical society in Montgomery County. A small grant had been awarded to document the Morehouse, the property, the interior, the structural elements that had been preserved for a permanent archive. The Historical Society had original crime scene photographs from the summer of 1912, taken 3 weeks after the murders by a photographer contracted by the county. They wanted a contemporary photographer to replicate the sight lines of those original photographs as precisely as possible so that future researchers could use the matched pairs to study how the house had and had not changed over more than a century. They wanted someone who knew how to read old photographs and reconstruct the physical conditions under which they had been taken. They contacted me in September. I drove to Villisca on the first Thursday of October. I want to describe what the town looks like from the highway, because it matters later and I want you to have it now, while it is still just description. The approach to Villisca from the east is along a county road that runs through harvested cornfields on both sides, flat and stubbled to the horizon, with the town appearing ahead as a cluster of trees above rooftops. The water tower visible first, then the grain elevator, then the steeple of the Methodist church. The sky that morning was a particular shade of pale gray that belongs to the Midwest in October specifically. Not dark, not threatening. Just the sky doing what skies in that part of the country do in that month, which is to close down slowly from above, like a hand pressing gently on the top of everything. The Morehouse is 3 blocks from the town square. I saw it from the corner before I parked. White clapboard, green trim, a front porch with a wooden swing. The upstairs windows caught the sky and threw it back, so that from the street, standing at the corner, you could not see into the upper floor at all. I parked and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. I was aware of the quiet. Small towns in October, after the harvest, have a specific quality of silence that is different from any other silence I know. Not empty, but finished. The way a room goes quiet when the last person has left it. Not abandoned, but concluded. I got out and went in. The woman who managed the property for the Historical Society was named Renata. She was in her 60s, practical and warm, with the particular manner of someone who has answered the same questions for many years and made her peace with the questions. She handed me a folder containing reproductions of the 1912 photographs, 12 images total, printed on standard copy paper, clear enough for reference work but not for fine detail, and gave me a key to the house, a list of rooms that were off limits to the general public but available to researchers, and a thermos of coffee. She told me the attic was accessible through a hatch in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. She told me the hatch had been there since the original construction and was documented in the county records from 1912. She told me, with the careful neutrality of someone who has said a thing many times, that some researchers found the attic distressing and that it was entirely acceptable to document it from below if I preferred. I told her I had been inside worse things than an attic, and thanked her for the coffee. She left, and I began. The ground floor first, as the original photographer had done. I worked room by room, matching the sight lines in the reference reproductions to the angles I could reconstruct from the furniture placement and window positions, setting my tripod at the heights indicated by the original frame geometry, taking my exposures, moving on. The parlor, the sitting room, the kitchen. The ground floor took most of the morning. I found the cloth in the parlor doorway at 11:47. I know the time because I log every frame. It was pressed into the keyhole of the parlor door, a small square of dark fabric, neatly folded, pushed flush with the keyhole plate so that if you did not know to look for it, you would not see it. I noticed it because I was matching a sight line from the second reproduction photograph, which showed the parlor door from approximately 8 feet back and slightly to the left, and the keyhole was in the frame. In the reproduction photograph, there was something in the keyhole. I looked at the reproduction. I looked at the door. The fabric in the keyhole matched. Same position, same fold, same dark color consistent with the material documented in the original case file, as, having been found pressed into the keyholes throughout the house. I photographed it and made a note. Possible original evidence element or period accurate recreation. Verify with Renata. I assigned it the most reasonable explanation available. The Historical Society had placed it there as part of their preservation of the house's documented condition, standard practice for a historical property. I moved on. The upstairs rooms in the afternoon, the children's room at the end of the hall. I want to be honest about this room. I have been inside rooms where people died. My professional relationship with those rooms is functional. I read them, I document them, I leave. I have spent 22 years making that relationship as clean as possible, and it is mostly clean. The children's room in the Moore house is not a room you can be clean inside. I spent 12 minutes in there and took 6 frames and left. The parents' room, the guest room where the Stillinger girls had been sleeping. These I moved through more efficiently, the way the body learns to move through things it needs to move through. The upstairs hallway last, as the original photographer had done. The attic hatch was in the ceiling at the far end of the hallway, above a 4-step wooden landing that led to nothing except the hatch. Square, latched from below. The latch a simple hook and eye that could be reached from the top step. Original hardware, consistent with the county records Renata had mentioned. In the fourth reproduction photograph, the one that showed the upstairs hallway from the staircase landing, looking toward the far end, the attic hatch was visible in the upper portion of the frame. I looked at the reproduction for a long moment. Then I looked at the hatch. The latch was not fully engaged. The hook sat in the eye, but had not been pressed home, so that the hatch was pulled shut, but not secured. The kind of almost close that you would not notice unless you were specifically checking, the kind that would settle open by perhaps a quarter inch if the house shifted, if the temperature changed, if something caused a subtle change in the air pressure of the space above. I climbed the 4 steps and pressed the hook fully into the eye and came back down. I stood at the top of the staircase and looked at the 4th reproduction photograph. The attic hatch in the photograph was the same, pulled shut, not latched. The original photographer had documented a hatch that was not fully closed. In 1912, 3 weeks after the murders, when the photograph was taken, the attic hatch had been left almost closed. I made a note. Attic hatch appears not fully latched in original documentation. Verify current condition against original. Note any discrepancy. I went back to Renata's office, which was a small converted room at the rear of the property, to charge my equipment and review the morning's frames before the afternoon light failed. She was not there. I let myself in and set up at the work table she had designated for my use. I pulled up the morning's frames on my laptop and began the comparison work, lining my contemporary photographs against the reference reproductions, checking angles and proportions, noting where the matches were strong and where the passage of time had altered the sight lines. I was on the 7th frame, the parlor interior, looking toward the east window, when I found it. The 7th frame was a near-exact match to the 2nd reproduction photograph. Same angle, same window light, same door visible at the left edge of the frame. I had the 2 images side by side on the screen. My contemporary photograph on the left, the 1912 original on the right. And I was working through the comparison section by section, the way I always do, left to right, foreground to background. In the background of the 1912 photograph, at the far left edge of the frame, the parlor doorway was partially visible. And in the parlor doorway, partially visible, was the door. And above the door handle, in the keyhole plate, there was something dark, something small and square and neatly folded. I had seen this in the reproduction. I had matched it to the cloth in the current keyhole. I had assigned it an innocent explanation. What I had not done, because I had been working from the printed reproduction, and not from the original photographic file, was look at the cloth in the original photograph at full resolution. The Historical Society had provided digital scans of the original glass plate negatives. The scans were in a folder on the drive Renata had given me. I had not opened them yet, because the reproductions were sufficient for the angle matching work I had been doing. I opened the scan of the 2nd photograph. At full resolution, the cloth in the keyhole was clear, dark fabric, neatly folded, pressed flush. And above it, in the thin gap between the door and the frame, the gap where a door that is not fully latched will admit a sliver of the room beyond, there was something else, a reflection. The parlor contained a mirror above the mantelpiece. In the original crime scene documents, this mirror was described as having been covered with a piece of cloth, consistent with all the mirrors in the house, all of which were covered before the murders. The cloth covering the parlor mirror was still in place 3 weeks later when the original photographs were taken. But the cloth was not a single piece. The description in the crime scene documents was a piece of cloth draped over the mirror. Draped, not fastened, not secured. A draped cloth over a period of 3 weeks. In a house that had been opened and closed and walked through by an estimated 100 people, would not hang perfectly straight. It would shift. It would admit gaps. In the reflection visible in the thin gap of the almost closed parlor door, caught at the specific angle of the original photographer's chosen sightline, in the partial gap of a cloth that had shifted over 3 weeks. There was a reflection of something behind the photographer. Reflections in photographs are secondary images. They are what falls within the reflective surface's frame at the moment of exposure. A mirror reflects what is behind the camera, not what is in front of it. I looked at the reflection for a long time. It was small, partial, the kind of detail that required the specific resolution of the original scan to resolve. Invisible in a reproduction, invisible to anyone reviewing the image without the training. To notice that a reflection in a visible reflective surface carries information about what the frame excluded. The reflection showed the upstairs hallway. The reflection showed the upstairs hallway because the parlor mirror, positioned above the mantelpiece, was angled slightly upward, as mantelpiece mirrors in that period often were, designed to reflect the room's occupants at a flattering angle, which meant that at the camera's height, the mirror reflected not the room, but the staircase visible through the open doorway at the far end of the parlor. I knew this was possible. I knew the mirror's documented position and angle. I had been in the parlor that morning. I knew exactly what that mirror, if uncovered, would have reflected from the angle of the second photograph. The reflection was small and partial and degraded by the 3 layers of optical remove. The mirror, the gap in the cloth, the gap in the door. And I am going to tell you exactly what it showed. It showed the upstairs hallway. It showed the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. It showed the attic hatch. The attic hatch in the reflection was open, not almost closed, the way it appeared in the 4th photograph taken from the hallway directly. Open, in the background of a reflection, in a gap in a cloth, in a gap in a door, in a photograph taken in a room on the ground floor of the house. The attic hatch at the far end of the upstairs hallway was open. I sat at Renata's work table with the scan open on my screen, and I looked at the reflection for a long time. My coffee was cold. I was aware of it being cold without meaning to notice it. My hands were flat on the table beside the laptop. The 4th photograph, the one taken in the upstairs hallway, showing the hatch directly, showed the hatch almost closed. The 2nd photograph, the one taken in the parlor, showing the hatch only as a reflection in a gap in a cloth, in a gap in a door, showed the hatch open. These 2 photographs were taken on the same day, by the same photographer, in the same commissioned documentation session. They appeared in the same collection, in the same sequence. Between the 2nd photograph and the 4th photograph, the attic hatch had been closed. Not by the passage of time. Not by the house settling. Between one photograph and the next, while the photographer moved from the parlor to the upstairs hallway. I understand what this means. I want to be precise about it, because precision is what I have, and I want to give you all of it. The attic hatch was open. when the parlor photograph was taken. When the photographer moved from the parlor and ascended the staircase to the upstairs hallway, the hatch was almost closed. Not fully latched, not secured, but pulled shut. Someone was above the hatch when the parlor photograph was taken. When the photographer began ascending the stairs, someone above the hatch pulled it almost closed. This is the only explanation consistent with the photographic evidence. A hatch visible as open in a reflection from below, and visible as almost closed when photographed directly from below 4 frames later, with no documented intervention in between, and no human being documented as having been in that attic on that day. This is not ambiguity. This is what the photographs record. I sat at the work table, and I thought, very clearly and without drama, that I was going to stand up and leave the property immediately. I sat at the work table instead. I am going to tell you what I thought about while I was sitting there, because it is relevant to what I understand now. In 2007, I testified in a wrongful death suit regarding an industrial accident in a processing facility in Ohio. I had reviewed the facility's photographic documentation, a series of images taken on the morning following the accident, before the site was cleared, and I had testified that the photographs were consistent with the official account that the accident had occurred due to equipment failure rather than negligent maintenance. I was right about the photographs. They were consistent with the official account. 8 months after the settlement, a discovery process in a related suit produced an additional set of photographs taken earlier on the same morning. Before the photographs I had reviewed, the earlier photographs showed evidence of maintenance activity in the hours before the accident that the later photographs had been taken specifically to exclude from the frame. I had been given photographs taken at angles chosen to show what the commission wanted shown. The angles were not falsified. The photographs recorded what fell within the frame, but the frame had been chosen by someone who knew what questions a forensic photographer would ask, and who had chosen the frame to answer those questions in a specific way. I was cleared of any professional failing. The concealment had been deliberate, and the angles had been chosen before I was involved. I read the photographs I was given. I could not have read the photographs I was not given. I told myself this for 15 years. It is accurate. But sitting at Renata's work table in October in Veliska, with the reflection on my screen and my hands flat on the table beside the laptop, I thought about it differently for the first time. The person who chose those angles in Ohio knew how I would read the photographs. They knew I would read the frame for what it contained and verify the contents against the official account. They knew that a forensic photographer, trained to read evidence, would read the evidence that was placed in front of her and would certify what the evidence showed. They had chosen the frame for someone who read the way I read. And in 1912, in Veliska, Iowa, a photographer had been sent into a house 3 weeks after 8 people were killed in their sleep, and had taken 12 photographs of the interior, and had gone home, and no one reviewing those 12 photographs in the 112 years since had noticed what the second photograph contained, because the second photograph required a reader who knew to look at the gap in the door for the gap in the cloth for the reflection in the mirror, for the image of the ceiling of the upstairs hallway, because the thing the second photograph recorded was not in the frame. It was behind the frame. It was what the photographer had been standing in front of when he took the picture, invisible to him, reflected back into the image at an angle he had not chosen and could not have anticipated. The second photograph had not been composed to show what it showed. What it showed had happened despite the composition. I closed the laptop. I sat in the room for a moment in the late afternoon light that came through Renata's small office window, thin and sideways, the way October light in Iowa comes through windows in the late afternoon. I thought, I need to go look at the cloth in the keyhole again. I have told people since then that I do not know why I felt I needed to do this. I think I do know. I think I needed to verify that the cloth was a recreation, something placed there by the Historical Society, something that had a documentable origin in the contemporary stewardship of the property. If the cloth was a recreation, then the cloth being there was explained. The cloth being there was someone's decision, made within the last few decades, for preservation or educational purposes. If the cloth was not a recreation, if the cloth had been there since 1912, unmoved and undisturbed through more than a century of visitors and investigators and overnight tourists and curious researchers, I did not finish that thought. I went to look at the cloth. The parlor was at the front of the house, 3 rooms from Renata's office. The late afternoon light had shifted so that the front of the house was in the shadow of the porch roof, and the parlor interior was dim. I turned on my flashlight and went in. I went to the parlor door and looked at the keyhole. The cloth was there, same position, same fold, same dark fabric. I photographed it at close range with my macro lens, then stood back and photographed it in context. The full door, the keyhole, the fold of fabric flush with the plate. Then I took out my reference folder and looked at the reproduction of the second photograph. The cloth in the reproduction was the same. Same position, same fold. I put the reproduction back in the folder. My mouth was very dry. This is what I remember specifically, not fear, exactly, but the body registering something before the mind has assembled it into language. The mouth going dry the way it goes dry when the body understands that something requires its full attention. I thought, I will ask Renata about the cloth when she comes back. Then I thought, it is after 5. She may have already left for the day. I went to check. Her car was gone. She had left a note on the work table saying she would return in the morning and to call the number on the note if I needed anything. I stood in her office and looked at the note for a moment. I decided to go upstairs and photograph the attic hatch from below, because I needed to complete the 4th reference match before the light failed entirely, and because doing something specific and procedural is how I have always managed the feeling I was currently managing. I went upstairs. The hallway was dim. I turned on the overhead fixture, which was a single bulb on a pull cord that threw adequate but not generous light. The 4-step landing at the far end. The hatch in the ceiling above it. The latch was not engaged. I had latched it 3 hours ago. I had climbed the 4 steps and pressed the hook into the eye and come back down. I had done this precisely because the hatch was not latched when I found it, and the unlatched hatch was inconsistent with the 4th reference photograph. and I had corrected the inconsistency before completing the sightline match. The latch was not engaged. I looked at the hatch for a long moment. I want to tell you what I was thinking, because being exact about it is the only thing I have to offer you that is worth anything. I was thinking that I had not latched the hatch correctly, that the hook had not seated properly in the eye, and had worked loose in the 3 hours since I had been in the hallway. I was thinking this clearly and deliberately, the way you think something that you are using as a wall between yourself and another thought. I was also thinking about the reflection in the second photograph, about what the attic hatch had looked like in that reflection, about the difference between almost closed and open. I set up my tripod at the top of the staircase. I matched the angle of the fourth reference photograph. I took the frame. In my photograph, the attic hatch was almost closed, not latched. This matched the fourth reference photograph exactly. I stood at the top of the staircase and looked at the hatch, and I thought, this is what the photographs show. I packed my tripod and went downstairs and got my bag and my laptop and my reference folder, and I left the house. I locked the front door behind me. I sat in my car on the street in front of the property. I looked at the upstairs windows, which reflected the pale gray sky back at me, so that I could not see into the upper floor at all. I called Renata that evening from my motel room. I asked her about the cloth in the parlor keyhole. She was quiet for a moment, then said she had assumed it was original to the house. It had been there when the Historical Society acquired the property, and no one had documented removing or replacing it. She said she had always assumed someone in the property's history, one of the previous owners who had operated it as a tourist attraction, had placed it there as part of the experience. She said she had never checked against the original documentation. I said, it appears in the photographs from 1912. 3 weeks after the murders. It appears to be original. There was a pause. She said, that is remarkable, she said. That would mean it has been there for over a century. I said yes. I said I would include the documentation in my final report. I did not tell her about the reflection. I did not tell her about the attic hatch. I have told almost no one about those things, because the photographs are evidence, and evidence should be precise. And what I can state precisely is limited. What I can state precisely. The second photograph contains a reflection that shows the attic hatch in an open position. The fourth photograph, taken in the same session, shows the attic hatch in an almost closed position. No human presence in the attic was documented on the day the photographs were taken. What I cannot state precisely. Anything beyond what the photographs show. What I know, photographs show what falls within the frame at the moment of exposure. They do not show what chose to remain outside the frame. I have been a forensic photographer for 22 years. I have spent those years reading photographs, reading them for what they contain, verifying their contents against official accounts, certifying what the evidence shows. What Viliska gave me, in addition to everything else it gave me, is this. I have never once asked, in 22 cases and 41 investigations and 11 trials, who chose where to point the camera. I have read the frame. I have trusted the frame. I have built my professional life on the premise that a frame chosen by someone else and handed to me for reading is a sufficient unit of evidence, that what falls within the frame is what is true, and that my job is to read the truth of it. what the second photograph in the Velisca documentation shows me, at full resolution in the gap of a door, and the gap of a cloth, and the angle of a mirror, not quite covered, is that what falls within the frame is only what the photographer chose to include, or in this case, what fell into the frame, despite the photographer's chosen angle, because the house contained a surface that reflected what the camera was not pointed at. What the second photograph shows me is that the frame always excludes something. It shows me that the something excluded is sometimes the thing that matters most. I have thought about the person who waited in the attic above the Moore family on the night of June 9th into the morning of June 10th, 1912. I have thought about what it requires of a person to wait in the dark above a sleeping family, in a space where the floor is also the ceiling of the rooms below, and to be patient in that darkness, while the sounds of the house go quiet one by one. I have thought about the cloth pressed into the keyholes, the careful neatness of it, the understanding it reflects, that a person who knows how evidence is read knows what to cover, that the same precision that goes into covering the keyholes also goes into covering the mirrors, almost completely, not quite. The house is still there on East 2nd Street. The cloth is still in the keyhole. I know this because my final archive photographs document it, and the Historical Society has confirmed they do not intend to disturb it. The attic hatch is still there. Whether it is latched or not, I cannot tell you. I did not go back. What I do know is that 112 years of investigators and researchers and curious visitors and historians walked through that house and looked at those photographs and read the frame and read what the frame contained and went home. I know that the second photograph was always there in the collection, available to anyone who had access to the original glass plate scan and the specific training to know what to look for in a reflective surface visible through a gap. I know that I was the first person to look at it that way. I know that being the first person to look at a thing that was always there, in a house where someone waited very patiently in the dark for a very long time, is not a comfortable position. The light in my home office is on when I work now. The overhead light and the desk lamp both. I did not used to do this. I worked in directed light before. The desk lamp only. The rest of the room dim. The way I was trained to view photographs, controlling the ambient light to reduce screen glare. I work with all the lights on now. I keep the door open. I am a reader of photographs. I know what photographs show. I know what they do not show, which is anything outside the frame, anything behind the camera, anything that chose to remain in the space the photographer was not pointing at. What I did not know for 22 years, and what I know now, is that there is no such thing as a complete frame. There is only what was pointed at, and what was not. The attic hatch in the reflection was open, and when the photographer climbed the stairs, it was almost closed. And I want you to understand what that means, and I want you to understand that I do understand it, and that understanding it is something I carry now in every quiet room I walk into, in every lit hallway, in every moment of stillness before I reach for the light switch. Someone learned to be very patient in the dark, and someone learned to close things very carefully, almost completely.